This podcast is brought to you with limited interruption by Rudy Luther Toyota. Whether looking for an exciting brand new Toyota, a certified pre-owned vehicle, or getting quality routine maintenance and service for your vehicle, Rudy Luther Toyota is the place to go. Rudy Luther Toyota, the southeast corner of 394 and 169 in Golden Valley. Subscribe to the podcast Beyond Politics. They host some of the biggest names and smartest minds. Beyond Politics is from a former Democratic congressman who helped ignite Barack Obama's campaign and a former campaign manager and political columnist. They go beyond the usual chatter on politics, news, science, and books. It's politics and everything beyond. On Beyond Politics, subscribe wherever you get your podcast.
You're listening to the Matt McNeil Show on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820 Heartland Signal in Chicago. It is not Matt McNeil today, as he is off. Instead, you are stuck with producer Brett Johnson filling in for Matt. Always fun to do this every now and then, as we're going to be talking about the latest in political news because, let's be honest, there's no shortage of topics to talk about, including, of course, Kamala Harris, now likely sitting at the top of the Democratic ticket. We'll be talking about what that means, as well as some of her stances on Social Security and Medicare, and how the Biden-Harris campaign and administration, rather, has been protecting Social Security and Medicare. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on, coming up at 3:30, as we'll be joined by Max Richtman of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We'll be talking about how Biden and Harris have protected Social Security and Medicare, and what they might be doing in a first term for a potential Kamala Harris presidency. That's coming your way at 3:30. But first, we are going to be talking about right-wing attacks against Kamala Harris. As joining us today is Courtney Hagle. She is a Media Matters Research Director from Media Matters, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to monitoring, analyzing, and correcting conservative misinformation in American media. As Courtney is going to help us delve into the persistent right-wing media conspiracies targeting Vice President Harris, from baseless claims about her eligibility to serve, all the way to birtherism, which, yes, has somehow made a return with Kamala Harris now running for president, despite the fact that she was born in Oakland, California. We'll explore the origins of these narratives, their impact on public perception, and what can be done to counteract this misinformation that we're certainly only going to see increase as the campaign goes on, with now Kamala Harris making her run for the presidency. So, Courtney, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and start talking about how the right-wing media, and whether this is legacy media or even through social media, has been treating Kamala Harris and how they've been trying to attack her. And I want to start off at least with the social media sphere, because there's a video going on TikTok right now that basically uses incoherent audio that wrongly attributed Vice President Harris, that made her basically sound very incoherent, where she basically said, today is today, yesterday was today yesterday, tomorrow will be today tomorrow, so live today, so future today will be as the past today as it is tomorrow. If that sounded incoherent, that's because it was misconstrued audio from Vice President Harris that was edited and put together by some right-wingers over on TikTok. So what I'm curious about with TikTok, Courtney, is that largely this platform doesn't have at least a lot of ways that it counteracts misinformation, which has made this a big breeding ground for trying to put through conspiracy theories against Kamala Harris, correct?
Yeah, TikTok's algorithm is set up to where things can spread and go viral very, very quickly. We wrote about this earlier in the week. My colleague Olivia Little was able to write about it. So after we wrote about it, TikTok actually did remove the audio and took some action to remove the videos in violation of their rules. They seem to kind of rely on a lot of that external reporting to kind of track down the misinformation, because TikTok is so decentralized in where and how a lot of things spread via the algorithm.
So we have that going on with TikTok right now, but let's talk about another aspect of how Harris has been attacked, and that has to do with birtherism, which, yes, I can't believe this is even making a return, being that, as I mentioned at the top of the interview, that Kamala Harris was born in Oakland, California. But can you talk about who's pushing this idea that she is not eligible to serve as president and what sorts of attacks they're using against her regarding this idea of birtherism?
Yeah, so this is appearing in, a lot of the usual kind of right-wing corners. Trump associate Tom Fitton, he's the president of Judicial Watch, a judicial organization. He's notably not, not a lawyer. So they're kind of questioning, again, where she was born, her eligibility to be president based on her citizenship. And just like Barack Obama, it's not based in anything. There's no factual basis. She was born in Oakland. So they're just kind of ginning up these racist kind of narratives and running the same playbook that they did against Barack Obama.
So at least moving to the legacy media standard as we look at organizations like whether it's Fox News or Newsmax or One America News, what have they been running against Kamala Harris in terms of their attacks? Because as I understand it, there's been a lot of, kind of grasping at straws, whether it's the likes of Sean Hannity or others. So what line of attack have they been using against her so far?
Yeah, grasping for straws is a good way to put it. As my colleague Matt wrote, they were really left flailing by his decision to back out. So much of the right-wing infrastructure was set up to run a campaign based around Biden specifically. They plan to attack his age, his mental and physical fitness, his competence, as well as so many of those kind of corruption charges they've ginned up over the years, weighing in his China business dealings, Hunter Biden, things like that. So it appeared as though they weren't really prepared with a playbook of compelling arguments against her. A lot of what we're seeing them say is stuff that they talked about back in 2020 when she was a primary candidate, mocking her laugh, calling her weird, claiming she's going to ban plastic straws, red meat, kind of going the Green New Deal playbook, which, again, completely baseless. There's nothing suggesting she's going to ban red meat. Probably the most unsurprising route is the racist and misogynistic attacks that, right-wing media immediately pivoted to, dredging up her dating history, attacking her for not having biological children, calling her a DEI candidate, diversity, equity, and inclusion, claiming she's never really earned any of the positions she's had in her career. She's an affirmative action candidate. So that's kind of the immediate attacks that we saw on her.
Now, what I'm interested in talking about, too, is that we've seen comparisons between Kamala Harris's campaign and what happened with Hillary Clinton back in 2016 when she, of course, was a female candidate running for president and endured many misogynistic attacks. But at least in my opinion, I think the right wing hasn't been able to at least hone their attacks versus Kamala as much as they were versus Hillary Clinton. What are your thoughts on that aspect? Do you think that would they have any luck trying to hone in any attacks, or do you think this is kind of different than what we saw with back in Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election cycle?
Yeah, so in my personal opinion, I think there's a few factors why it's maybe not landing quite the same as it did in 2016. One of them is, of course, Hillary Clinton was a unique candidate who had, 20 years being in the public light. She ran for president in 2008. She was first lady in the 90s. Republicans had a 20-year head start on branding her that they really have not against Kamala Harris. Another thing I would point out is, this is a very different environment. In 2016, we had only known Trump, the politician, for 1 year. We had never really seen him as a president. Some people didn't really understand or know quite what he was capable of, after what he's done with the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade. Those kind of attacks just aren't really front of mind as a concern for a lot of voters. And I would also just say this is a very different environment in terms of, attacks on reproductive rights, things like that. And so some of these really sexist, lowbrow attacks, they just are not landing. In my opinion, I don't think they will land very well with the general public, especially we've known Trump in the political light for 8 or 9 years now. So when they dredge up her dating history, for example, from 20 years ago as a mark against her. You know, their candidate is Donald Trump. So it's really hard to make some of those attacks stick when they have a candidate with as much baggage who has been front and center for 8 years as he has.
Yeah, especially when I hear rumors that they're potentially going to be trying to Willie Horton her with unfair attack ads about her time as a prosecutor in California, which, as you were kind of alluding to, well, look at the guy she's running against who has 34 felonies. I'm not sure even that line of attack would have quite as much success. But at least I'm curious what your opinion is on this. What is the best way to counteract some of this misinformation that we see from many of these right-wing figures and right-wing outlets? Obviously, organizations like you guys, Media Matters, which you can learn more about over at MediaMatters.org, does a great job at trying to counteract some of this right-wing misinformation. But what's a good way to counteract when you have someone saying, well, look, Kamala Harris is not eligible to serve for president because she wasn't from this country, or you have someone that pick any other right-wing attack, whether she's incoherent or is weak as a prosecutor. What are some of the ways that are effective, at least, at countering some of this misinformation that we're likely to see against her in the future?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the question we're always wanting to answer ourselves. The misinformation is so prevalent right now. It can be very difficult, especially, if you're talking to someone who really believes the birtherism stuff. That's possibly someone who isn't going to be very receptive to facts, particularly when the right has set up this factual infrastructure, or not factual, but their own set of facts on their side. So the best thing, in my opinion, you can do is just keep repeating the truth, keep presenting as much of the factual information you can, but really try and just drown them out. Be louder, have a bigger megaphone, because, again, these people are going to believe the things they want to believe. And if you are at a point right now where you strongly believe Kamala Harris is not eligible or she's not a citizen of the United States, then there's a good chance that you're not someone who's really operating under those facts anyway. And so, again, that's something we struggle with at Media Matters. I've gotten that question before. How do we stop the misinformation? We do the best we can with publishing our content. I encourage people to go to our website and use our resources. We've written about the birtherism. Another one is the right labeling her the border czar for the Biden administration, when that's never been the case. That was a, Republican branded attack against her. She was never set up as in charge of immigration for the administration. So I think the best you can kind of do is just present facts and, more importantly, try and drown out the people who are trying to spread misinformation.
Well, we are down to about our last minute, and I want to thank you, Courtney Hagle. She is the research director for Media Matters, joining us on the show, doing some great work with you and your colleagues, watching right-wing media and monitoring that to try to counteract some of these unfair attacks, misinformation. I don't know how you keep your sanity watching things like Fox News and One America News and the other likes, but you guys are definitely doing good work, because I frequently check out your website just to see what the right wing is doing to try to attack, rather than trying to watch some of these outlets myself. So make sure you check it out.
Yeah, that's what we're here for.
Absolutely. Make sure you check them out. Give them a follow over at MediaMatters.org, and make sure you check out their social media accounts. Again, that is MediaMatters.org. Courtney, thanks so much for joining me on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was great being here.
All right, we'll take a break and come on back with more here on the Matt McNeil Show. Brett Johnson filling in here on this Tuesday afternoon. We'll talk a little bit about some VP sweepstakes coming up next here on AM 950.
What I like, I lose control. Shave my head and dance with girls.
And we're back on the Matt McNeil Show. Brett Johnson filling in for Matt here on your Tuesday afternoon, as Matt is off today. Also listening here on WCPT 820 Heartland Signal. Glad to have you with us as we are talking about big political news for today, obviously with Kamala Harris now likely going to be sitting at the top of the Democratic ticket for president. Short segment right now is we're going to talk about some VP sweepstakes, or is it Veep stakes? I'm not sure which it is. We'll talk about maybe who are some of the best candidates for that position as VP, and then I want to talk a little bit as well about Project 2025 and how the Trump administration, potential Trump administration, wants to completely revamp how the federal workforce is put together. But Let's start things off before we get to Max Richtman with the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare in the next segment about who might be some of the best fits to be Kamala Harris's running mate. So far, at least as the list I've seen, among maybe the top 6 to 8 candidates, we've seen North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, and then, at least locally to us that live in Minnesota and Illinois, we have on that short list Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. So I'm curious what your thoughts might be on this. We're at 952-946-6205, 952-946-6205, because the question is whether VPs really make a difference in a presidential race. I argue that they largely don't unless you pick someone who is extraordinarily bad or maybe extraordinarily helpful. For instance, if we go back to the 2008 campaign, I would make the argument that Joe Biden was very effective at helping Barack Obama get into the White House, simply because at that time Obama was a relatively, at least this was the perception of him, being a very inexperienced politician who had only served 2 years in the U.S. Senate prior to spending a few years in the state legislature. He was able to bring on someone like Joe Biden, who, of course, had a wealth of experience back in 2008 to sort of balance the ticket. And, of course, if we look back to 2008 on the Republican ticket, John McCain ended up going with the infamous Sarah Palin, who I might argue at the time probably was a good risk for John McCain to take, simply because back in 2008 he was trailing so far in the polls that he largely needed to shake things up and needed to try that so-called Hail Mary to get back in the race. Unfortunately for him, and, well, fortunately for us as a country, that decision completely backfired, choosing Sarah Palin as his running mate. And, of course, McCain ended up losing to Obama by a pretty wide margin back during the 2008 election. But really, outside of that 2008 election cycle, there really haven't been many VP picks that have had a major impact on the race. Usually, I think they only do if you have someone that is running either way ahead or way behind, where typically if you have someone that's way ahead, you want to pick a very safe candidate, or if you are running behind, maybe you want to be a little more risky. So let's talk about Kamala Harris now. Does she need to make that big risk in terms of determining who should be her running mate? At least the way I'm thinking about it, largely not, because I think we have such a hyper-partisan political atmosphere right now that it really is not going to make a huge difference who she picks in terms of how it will impact things electorally. Where I think it could have a big impact is a potential successor in 4 or 8 years from now, for when Kamala Harris will either be running for re-election or will be term limited from running for another term. So at least running through some of these candidates right now, what I think is important to look at is that be careful about picking anyone from the Senate, because if you pick a Democratic senator, you open up a seat in the Senate, which means you're going to have a special election, and as we've seen in the past, those can oftentimes go either way. So I think you largely want to stay away from picking a senator as your running mate, which probably rules out someone like Mark Kelly from Arizona, who, by the way, I would argue would have been a very strong general election candidate as president, just being that he's from a border state and is very well liked. But he is, at least in the Veep stakes so far, to try to be VP, as he has received some inquiries. But I would be skeptical as to whether they pick him, simply because if Harris were to win the presidency, that would mean an open Senate seat in Arizona, and that is very much a 50-50 state, and you could potentially have that go back to the Republicans should Kelly be elevated to the vice presidency. Now, as we look at some of the governors, that's a different area, because obviously if you pick a governor to be a vice presidential candidate and you go on to win the presidency, well, the governor can then turn things over to the lieutenant governor to take over their position. Now, one of the arguments I've heard is for a guy named Andy Beshear from Kentucky. Beshear, of course, is from a very red state. That would be Kentucky, which is about 75% Republican, but somehow he was able to win election back in 2022 as well as 2018. In fact, he's not even eligible to run again in 2026. So the argument goes with someone like Beshear, since he is term limited and Republicans already have an overwhelming legislature where he's largely able to not veto anything. The thought is that, well, if you go with Andy Beshear, sure, you take him out of the state of the Kentucky, but you at least still have his lieutenant governor that's able to still staff that office and at least perform some of the duties and keep that state from going in a completely right-wing direction, especially since most prognosticators say Kentucky very likely to go back to a Republican governor in 2026. So I could see Beshear possibly being a good pick for Kamala Harris. As we look at some others, obviously here in our state of Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz has an attractive profile, being that he is from a Midwestern state. He is a two-term governor. He's a former teacher and someone who used to serve in the National Guard. He also was originally born in Nebraska, which does kind of create that Midwest appeal for those that live in, like, let's say, Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, which are very important battleground states. J.B. Pritzker, of course, has also been mentioned. He is the governor of Illinois, as I'm sure you're aware if you're listening to us on Heartland Signal. And that would provide a different dynamic if Harris were to pick Pritzker and then they were to go on and win the presidency and the vice presidency, because obviously Illinois is a very blue state, and it would be likely that the governor's mansion would stay in Democratic hands. So he's a possibility as well, but at least my dark horse right now, probably going to be Andy Beshear as a potential VP nominee for Kamala Harris. Let's get some phone calls right now and go to Tom in Ramsey, who wants to chime in. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Thanks for taking the call. And prior to you putting in your dark horse bid for Beshear, I think I would have agreed with you, because I think he has the fact that he is a Democratic governor and in an overwhelmingly red state could have some appeal in that part of the country, in that portion of the Rust Belt. I don't think Pritzker is a viable candidate. I think he represents the elitist, in quotes, that the Republicans love to rail against, because he's from a very wealthy family and a bit of a silver spoon candidate. I think they can't afford to lose Gretchen Whitmer as the governor of Michigan as a firewall, and I think the same thing for Shapiro in Pennsylvania. I think if you lost Shapiro in Pennsylvania, you'd really run the risk of not only losing the governorship, but then allowing the state government allowing some restrictions on voting and the like that could put those electoral votes in peril in the future.
Yeah, and of course, you run the risk of turning that into a Republican trifecta, being that Pennsylvania's legislature is very evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. Tom, unfortunately, I am up against a hard break, so we're going to have to leave it there. But stay tuned, as coming up next, we're going to be talking about Social Security and Medicare and Kamala Harris, so stick with us. Listening to the Matt McNeil Show on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820 Chicago Heartland Signal. I'm a busy guy here, as you heard me doing that weather forecast just a moment ago. I'm doing a little bit of everything today, including filling in for Matt McNeil, but glad to have you with us here on this Tuesday afternoon. Well, this segment, we're going to be talking about the future of Social Security and Medicare with Max Richtman, who is the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. As we're going to be talking with Max about the Biden-Harris administration's achievements in lowering prescription drug prices and protecting benefits, and the contrasts between their policies and those proposed by Donald Trump. So, Max, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate that as well.
Absolutely, because Social Security and Medicare are very important, and as we're going to talk about in just a few moments, there are some drastically different ideas for how we strengthen Social Security and Medicare between what we would see from a potential second Trump administration versus what we would see in a potential Kamala Harris administration. But before we get into all of that, I want to talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, because this is a major piece of legislation that I think a lot of people, when they look and hear about the Inflation Reduction Act, they don't really know necessarily what was in that bill. But Max, can you fill us in on how the Inflation Reduction Act really benefited seniors, in particular in terms of how drug price negotiation and capping insulin costs were a big help towards seniors?
Well, it was historic to begin with. The Medicare program added a prescription drug component back in 2003. And I was working here at the National Committee at the time. And at the very last minute of that legislation working its way through Congress, a provision was inserted that specifically, hard to believe this, but specifically prohibits the government from negotiating for the best price for prescription drugs with the pharmaceutical companies. This made no sense at the time, and made no sense for the next 20 years. That's how long it's taken to reverse that. You have an entity representing tens of millions of people, Medicare beneficiaries, that just has to accept whatever pharma dictates for prescription drug costs. So finally, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the votes were there, and administration was promoting the change that not just allows but mandates the government to negotiate for the best price for prescription drugs for Medicare beneficiaries. It wasn't everything we wanted. We were hoping it would cover more drugs, happen much faster, but it was better than the previous circumstance when there was that prohibition in place. So 10 drugs the first year, more drugs added over the next few years, and eventually it will have an enormous impact for Medicare beneficiaries. You know, I've talked to a lot of groups in the last couple of months, and the impact has not been felt yet because it was a process that was developed over time. As I said, a number of drugs the first year and more added on. But I think as the years go by, the next couple of years, Medicare beneficiaries will be grateful for the help they've received from the Inflation Reduction Act in holding the cost down. Beyond that, as your listeners probably know, there's an immediate benefit of a cap on insulin costs, $35 a month, as opposed to $300 or $400 a month. That's already in effect. And starting in a few months, starting next year, there will be a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket drug costs for every Medicare beneficiary. That is a huge improvement. And as I say, some of these benefits will become clearer over the next couple years, but we're on the right path.
And just to be clear, I want to talk about a little bit more about how big a deal this is to allow Medicare to be able to actually negotiate drug prices, because prior to this, well, you largely had to take whatever the drug company said was the price, and now that we can have this actually negotiated by the federal government, we can probably get lower prices from seniors, which is a big deal. And I think it's important to point out the contrast with what we see from the Heritage Foundation and groups like Project 2025, or at least with Project 2025, they largely want to repeal that aspect and turn things back over to the drug companies, correct?
Right. I mean, it's pretty clear which side is for seniors and which side does not have that kind of regard for seniors. The project that you mentioned, 2025, would repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, take us back 20 years to when we had to be in a situation where it was really take it or leave it when it came to the pharmaceutical industry. This is what we charge. This is what you're going to pay. And as I said, when you have as much clout as the Medicare program has, representing so many millions of people, to be prohibited from negotiating, that was a win for the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years, and this Inflation Reduction Act is clearly a win for seniors, and we should be grateful to the Biden-Harris administration for making this change happen.
We are speaking with Max Richtman, who is the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Your group, by the way, just came out and officially endorsed Kamala Harris for president. And in your release, you mentioned the need to put Social Security and Medicare on sound financial footing. What specific measures do you believe are necessary to achieve that?
Well, you know, Social Security has a trustees report that is issued every year, in the spring. The report that we saw a couple months ago told us that the program is able to pay everybody all their benefits until the year 2034. There's 2034, it's been bouncing around between 2034 and 2035 for the last couple of years. But at that point, if there's no action, benefits will be reduced by about 18%. That's pretty dramatic. I don't know of a politician who'd want to go back home and tell his constituents, I didn't do my job and your benefits as a Social Security recipient are going to be cut by 17 or 18%. So something will happen. The question really is, how do we extend that solvency? We have supported legislation that I think is fair, that would bring more revenue into the program without cutting benefits. Benefits, as you know, are pretty modest. Most Social Security beneficiaries are not living in luxury on the Social Security check they receive. So the answer to extending the solvency is not cutting benefits. It is bringing more revenue into the program. You know, I mentioned that I've done a lot of town hall meetings. I've done them for years. There are many people who are unaware that there's a limit, a cap, on the wages that are subject to the payroll tax. It changes a little bit every year. This year, I think it's $168,600. After that, no more payroll tax. Why? We support eliminating that cap altogether. Politically, that's probably not going to happen. It's not realistic. And so we have supported legislation that keeps the cap at what it is, and again, it goes up a few $1,000s every year, but starts again collecting payroll taxes at $400,000 in wages and above. That brings in enough revenue to extend the solvency beyond 2034 and to have some improvements in the benefit structure of the program. So that's consistent with President Biden's pledge of not to raise taxes on anyone earning less than $400,000 a year. And it, as I said, extends the solvency of Social Security in, I think, a very fair way.
Well, I can tell you one way not to fund Social Security in the future, and that would be going back to what we saw during the Trump administration of their so-called Social Security payroll tax holiday. I use holiday very much in quotes. Can you talk about why this idea was so disastrous back when the Trump administration did this? Because this can cause all sorts of havoc in terms of trying to fund Social Security.
Absolutely. Well, I think, as you point out, during the pandemic, President Trump suspended the Social Security payroll tax. I'm not even sure he fully comprehended or comprehends even today how the program works, that its primary source of revenue is the payroll tax, and that is the tax that so many people that funds the program that so many people depend on. And by this was a pointless, reckless move by the administration that would have damaged the program even further if it had been continued. So, I'm not sure what motivated all that. Maybe it was panic because of the COVID, but it was totally unnecessary, unrealistic, reckless, and fortunately, that was not extended.
And I think what makes a policy like that so dangerous is that it can be attractive to someone like Trump, who very much thinks in the short term about his own political gains, because you can sit there and think, well, if we have this payroll tax holiday, that means in the short term, more money on your paycheck. Obviously, in the long term, that means no money in Social Security, which will end up costing you a lot more in the long run as compared to having a few extra bucks in your pocket from that payroll tax holiday, correct?
Well, you're so correct. I mean, it was clearly a politically motivated move. and it's not consistent with the agenda of someone who supports the Social Security program. You can't do both. You can't undermine the program by suspending the payroll tax, undermining the funding of the program, and then talk about how you support Social Security, you support seniors. You can't do both. And we saw clearly where the former president came down on that issue.
Now, you mentioned in your press release as well that there were some concerns about the Medicare Advantage plan. So I'm curious what steps the Biden-Harris administration has taken to address some of the issues we've seen from Medicare Advantage and some of the problems that's been caused by it.
Well, I think they've been very focused on some of the advertising in the Medicare Advantage program. I'm sure you've seen it out there. You can't really watch television very long without watching Joe Namath, right?
Oh, yes.
Pitch Medicare Advantage plans, or William Shatner pitch Medicare Advantage plans. I'm sure you see that on television out where you are, just as I do here. And these proposals to get people to buy Medicare Advantage are really very misleading. There are a lot of problems with Medicare Advantage programs that people that sign up only find out about once they're stuck. Once you get into a Medicare Advantage plan and you realize that you can't pick your own doctor, you have limits. There are limits in that regard, and the kinds of medical services you can access. And you think, well, maybe I'll go back to traditional Medicare. It's not that easy. There are hoops that you have to go through, and in some cases you may not be able to go back into traditional Medicare. So we have been doing whatever we can over the last few years to make it clear to Medicare beneficiaries that if you want to go into a Medicare Advantage program, here's what you ought to know. Don't just be.
Hey Max, can I have you hang on for? Can I have you hang on for the other side of the break? I have a hard break coming up in just a few seconds, but we'll love to chat more with you about Medicare Advantage as well as what we could be seeing on the future in the campaign trail. So stick with us here on the Matt McNeil Show as you are listening to Brett Johnson filling in for Matt on WCPT 820 and AM 950. We're back on the Matt McNeil Show on a Tuesday afternoon. Brett Johnson filling in for Matt, who is off today. As we are also on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820 Heartland Signal in Chicago. Glad to have you with us. Right now we are joined by Max Richtman, who is the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. As we're talking about how Social Security and Medicare are going to be potentially treated by a Harris administration versus a potential Trump administration. And Max, before we went to break, we were talking about Medicare Advantage, this privatized Medicare Advantage plans, and how the Biden-Harris administration has taken some action to at least address some of the issues that we see with Medicare Advantage. Now, I know I had interrupted you because we have that unfortunate hard break that was up against the clock just a few moments ago, but I'd like to continue with what you were talking about with some of these problems that we're seeing with Medicare Advantage, and specifically how, largely as you were talking about, if you are on Medicare Advantage and want to go back to traditional Medicare, well, for the most part, that's a very difficult process.
Right. Well, as I was saying, it really, what I'm talking about is truth in advertising. I guess you could call it that. There are people who like Medicare Advantage. A lot of Medicare beneficiaries have decided that's what they want, but I think that they ought to understand that what are the downsides, including if you decide to go back to traditional Medicare, how difficult that might be. How you may find denials and pre-authorization for procedures that you need. that are covered by traditional Medicare but may not be covered by Medicare Advantage. And as I say, our issue with the whole program, Medicare Advantage program, is a question of being honest to the consumer about what's at stake, what you get, what you may lose, what is what you may risk in terms of getting traditional Medicare services. And the other thing I think is very important to understand is where the origin of Medicare Advantage. The whole experiment with Medicare Advantage, I think, has failed. Medicare Advantage, when it was instituted a number of decades ago, was supposed to save the government money. And the Medicare Advantage programs, these are private insurers, right? They were subsidized by the federal government initially to build up clientele. The Medicare Advantage programs are costing the government more money, not less money, per beneficiary than those that are in traditional Medicare. You have insurance companies involved. They want to make money. They're in this business to make money. The Medicare program is not in the healthcare business to make money. It's to provide services. So rather than saving the government money, Medicare Advantage programs have done just the opposite. Taxpayers are paying more per beneficiary for a Medicare Advantage beneficiary than someone who's in traditional Medicare. And I know there have been investigations ongoing for overbilling the government by millions of dollars by these Medicare Advantage insurers who frankly put the priority on profits, not on patients.
And final question for you, Max, and that is the fact that I believe, at least with Project 2025 / the Heritage Foundation, which is largely just an extension of the Trump campaign, they are very much on board with trying to expand Medicare Advantage, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, you remember a long time ago, former Speaker Newt Gingrich talked about a Medicare Advantage approach to Medicare that would eventually lead to, quote, Medicare withering on the vine. Remember that? This has been the plan for a long time, 25, 30 years. And Project 2025 wants to extend it. Their whole approach to these government programs is you're better taking care of yourself. You're on your own. Good luck. And I'm not even sure about the good luck part, but that's been the approach. And Medicare Advantage, privatizing Social Security, that's part of that whole plan.
We have been speaking with Max Richtman. He is the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. As again, they recently came out and endorsed Kamala Harris for president. You can learn more about the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare over at ncpssm.org. Again, that's ncpssm.org. Encourage you to check them out because they do a good job breaking down some of the Trojan horses that we see from Republicans and other politicians that try to say they're improving Social Security and Medicare when oftentimes it's quite the opposite. So make sure you check them out, ncpssm.org. Max, really appreciate the time today. Good to chat with you, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we have a few more minutes left here before we have to wrap things up for the hour, and just wanted to briefly touch a little bit more on Project 2025. One of the big aspects of Project 2025, I should say, is that they want to change and completely revamp the federal workforce where it's not just going to be the usual people who are appointed by the president. They're talking about having thousands and thousands of workers, converting them from being merit-based employees to being political appointees, which means, in other words, they want you as a new federal worker to pledge loyalty to the president instead of pledging loyalty to the Constitution, which is a major problem because we've actually been through this battle before in American history. go back and look at the political climate we experienced back in the 1870s and 1880s. It's amazing how history repeats itself. This was one of the major issues that divided the political parties back in the 1870s and the 1880s, was the idea of trying to come up with a professionalized federal workforce, because prior to that era, pretty much everyone that worked for the federal government was a political appointee, and that, of course, led to lots of corruption, including with, at the time, President Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, it was largely his undoing. So be very careful about this idea of not privatizing, but making everyone loyal to the president instead of the Constitution with our federal workforce, because we've been through this battle before, and it's not a good thing. Stay tuned. We got Hour 2 of the Matt McNeil Show coming up next here on AM 950 and WCPT 820 Chicago. It's Hour 2 of the Matt McNeil Show with Brett Johnson filling in today. Matt will be back next week, but we have lots of great guest hosts lined up for the rest of this week and early next week. In fact, tomorrow we're going to have J.P. D'Abrogossi on from This Queer Book Saved My Life and The Gailey Show. He is going to be filling in tomorrow. Then Thursday and Friday we'll go with Greg Bakken of Ghost Box Radio with Greg Bakken, as we'll add a little spookiness to the Matt McNeil Show as he'll bring his perspective to the show. So looking forward to hearing Greg talk a little politics on Thursday and Friday. Then coming up next week, we'll have more great guest hosts filling in, including Nancy Nelson on Monday. Since I know Patrick did yeoman's work yesterday trying to answer the phone calls with how many people wanted to chat with Nancy, I don't blame you. Nancy's a legend here in the Twin Cities in broadcasting, and we love bringing her on the airwaves whenever we can. Patrick, I know you had some fun producing Nancy's show yesterday, which was a very, very busy show, but some good stuff.
Absolutely. If you'd missed it yesterday, also check out Marge Hoffa, the first vice chair of the DFL, stopped in for most of the 4 p.m. hour. So lots of people giving their thoughts on what happened with Biden deciding not to seek re-election. Also did have that great visit from first vice chair Hoffa as well. It's all posted up on SoundCloud and on our AM 950 radio website, so if you missed it yesterday, definitely want to get it just to get a pulse on what people are feeling about the situation.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Did I hear you correctly when we were talking before the show that Mike McEntee made an appearance on the show?
Yes, he made an appearance. That was early in the 4 p.m. hour. It sounds like he and his wife were on their way to the cabin, so a good time certainly for him to drop in, and I know Nancy was certainly very excited to have him back on as well.
I mean, I was going to say, I only produced Mike McEntee's show for about 2 or 3 years, and he didn't come on mine, but I guess if he's going to the cabin this weekend, or this week, I should say, I won't hold it against him too much. But Mike, if you're listening out there, what the heck, man? You didn't come on my show today, but I don't blame you, though. It's always fun to go on with Nancy Nelson. Hey, before we jump into my interview with Patrick Coolican, who, of course, I normally speak with on Tuesdays on Matt's show, I wanted to get to some other news I saw in the headlines right now. So Sunday, obviously, was a big day, since that was when Joe Biden announced that he was not going to be seeking re-election, and when Democrats largely started coalescing around Kamala Harris. But there was another piece of news on Sunday to pay attention to, and this is in the not-so-good news department. Global temperatures hit their highest levels in recorded history on Sunday. That's according to preliminary data from Europe's top climate monitors. So overall on Sunday, the hottest day ever recorded globally in human history. Yeah, that's not exactly a good piece of news. And wanted to cover one more thing that you might find interesting. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they're coming to Minnesota this Saturday. They're going to be making an appearance on Saturday night in, well, very fitting, St. Cloud, since I think they might find that crowd a little friendlier up in that area as opposed to maybe being here in the Twin Cities. Although I can't knock St. Cloud, since that is a relatively blue area. It's some of the surrounding areas up in central Minnesota that get very, very red. But that's where Trump and Vance will be. I can't say that's going to be on my list of things to do this weekend, but they are coming to town for better or for worse. Again, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance rallying in St. Cloud on Saturday night. Well, here's the plan for the rest of the hour. We have 2 really good interviews lined up that I encourage you to stick around for. Coming up at 4:30, we are going to be joined by Aaron Brown of Minnesota Brown, as he is going to be talking about an experience his mother had a couple of years ago and is still largely lingering in their family. what happened is that his mother, back in November of 2022, suffered a pretty serious stroke. And Aaron, of course, lives in a rural area of northern Minnesota up on the Iron Range. And he talks about his personal story with his mother about how they really had a struggle trying to find effective health care and trying to get the care that his mother needed in order to rehab from her stroke, as we talk about some of the challenges that rural Minnesotans face when it comes to getting access to quality health care. It really wasn't any problem with the hospital or any of their workers specifically. It's just a lack of workers and a lack of resources in rural America. So we're going to be chatting about that coming up at 4:30. But coming up next, we are going to be speaking with Patrick Coolican of the Minnesota Reformer, talking about some of the big news they've been working on, including Patrick's column, which basically calls out Tom Emmer for trying to originally be someone who was very much pro-immigration, now has completely changed that stance and so-called bent the knee for Donald Trump. He has a great takedown of Tom Emmer that we're going to be chatting about, as well as some of the other great news they've been working on over at the Minnesota Reformer. So stick with us. Coming up next, it's my conversation with Patrick Coolican of the Minnesota Reformer here on AM 950. AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, right now we're joined by the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. That's Patrick Coolican for his usual Tuesday weekly visit, as we have lots of news to cover in the world of politics today, being that, well, obviously we have a change of the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party, as we'll be talking about that and how many of the DFLers and power brokers within the Democratic Party here in Minnesota were able to coalesce around Kamala Harris. Plus, we'll be talking about Patrick's column on Tom Emmer and taking a look back at his previous stances on immigration and how they have evolved over the years to largely, well, fit the mold of Donald Trump and his ilk. Plus, we'll be talking about a Republican candidate for Minnesota House who's part of Action for Liberty that has run into a number of tax troubles himself. So, Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking, of course, about the big news, and that obviously is Kamala Harris. Now, the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. There still technically is going to be a primary race at the convention, but it looks like she is very much the front runner, and many DFLers and big-name Democrats here in Minnesota have began to coalesce around Kamala Harris and endorse her, including Amy Klobuchar, Tina Smith, Ilhan Omar, Dean Phillips, and others. But in what you wrote over the weekend, Patrick, you talked about how there was one key name that joined that list in that endorsement of Kamala Harris, which was very key, and that is the chair of the DFL, Ken Martin. Talk about the significance of his endorsement behind Kamala Harris and why this is such a big deal.
Yeah, I people may not know the name, but he's the DFL chair in his fifth term. He's also well-known nationally because the Minnesota Democratic Party is considered one of the best-run and most effective. And he's just been an effective and shrewd operator. And so when he came out with kind of a full-throated endorsement at a press conference on Sunday afternoon, I took that to be pretty significant insofar as it signaled to me that the party insiders were really quickly coalescing around Harris, and there wasn't going to be much room for an alternative. Because if you remember the few weeks leading up to the resignation, when President Biden announced he was not going to run for re-election, I think there was quite a bit of speculation about some sort of open primary and some kind of, or open convention, I should say, and a mini primary, and various names were being bandied about. And I think leadership of the Democratic Party, such as it is, because it is a lot more chaotic than people think, and there are not a half dozen people making decisions in Washington or anything like that. But I do feel like there was a consensus that there needed to be fast movement, and I know Ken Martin, having known him and covered him for a decade, there are a few things that you hear from him repeatedly, and one of them is that the one thing you can't get more of in a campaign is time, and the risk of some sort of intra-party battle for the nomination was going to quickly reduce the amount of simple days that they have between now and Election Day to coalesce and get ready and go. So I knew that he would want to press that point, and sure enough, he did. He also doesn't like contentious, expensive primaries, and so he was really laying down a marker for not just Minnesota delegates, but I think for state party chairs around the country. He's the head of the Democratic State Party Chair Association, and certainly somebody who's got the ear of the White House and the DNC. So I thought that was significant, and sure enough, the things moved really quickly, and she had the nomination wrapped up. I think really you would say by Monday noon, it seemed like it was a done deal, and now it is.
And of course, he is key in lining up not just obviously our elected officials here in Minnesota that are Democrats, but even superdelegates, a term you might remember back from a few conventions ago. And we do have some Minnesota superdelegates, so obviously he was influential in getting them on board with Kamala Harris. But what about the other delegates in Minnesota? How have they been lining up? Have they pretty much also been going on board for Kamala Harris as well?
Yeah, Minnesota Public Radio, they tried to reach all of them on Sunday. And of those that they reached, I think it was something like 41 that were Harris, and there was a little more than a dozen, maybe a baker's dozen of folks who said they declined to say, or they wanted an open convention or had some other answer. And there's only, I think, 90 or so delegates, so of the 55 or so that they reached, 40 were with Harris, and I'm sure if you ask those remaining 15, a lot of them would be with Harris by now. So I think those delegates are firmly in hand, and we know she has enough delegates to get the nomination, and there's been no serious alternative put forward. So I think I also just feel like the party, after such a divisive few weeks, when there were people saying that President Biden has to withdraw from re-election, and then those who were backing him, and it was getting pretty ugly. I think everybody on the Democratic folks, rank and file Democrats, were really eager to see some unity and some energy around a new candidate right away. And I think that's what we're seeing.
So obviously it looks like, the presidency is largely sealed up in terms of a Democratic nomination with Kamala Harris. But, of course, the other office that is not sewn up yet is the vice presidential nominee. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, and even what we've heard from some of the elected DFLers here in Minnesota, what their thoughts are on Tim Walz possibly filling that void, since he does have many assets that, at least on paper, could be beneficial to anyone who would be running for president on behalf of the Democratic Party, being that he, of course, is from the Midwest and has been a two-term governor of the state. What are you hearing about speculation around Tim Walz possibly being a VP candidate?
Yeah, on paper, there's a lot there to like. There's the National Guard. I think he's the highest-ranking enlisted man in the U.S. Congress and in American history. Teacher, football coach. He helped Democrats get a trifecta here. They passed a bunch of progressive policies. Minnesota's a top state when you consider things like life expectancy and wages and healthcare outcomes and education outcomes. So there's a story to tell about Minnesota. He's a good communicator. I mean, he can be a little uneven on that front in terms of clarity, but generally speaking, he really does well, especially with a live audience. He's for the last 18 months or so. He's been doing a lot of national media, so he's really well experienced in that. The problem for Walz, and I think there's also a belief that he could appeal. He's from Nebraska, he's in Minnesota, that he really would appeal to white working class voters that you need in the blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and including the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska, where you can pick up an electoral college vote. The problem I see is that Minnesota is not really a battleground state. If Minnesota is a battleground state, then the election's over, and Donald Trump's going to be president, to be honest. And so they're probably looking at somebody from a state that's much more in play. That's why I think Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, or Mark Kelly, U.S. Senator and former astronaut from Arizona, are probably higher on the list. But you never know. I think the vice president is often just somebody who meshes well with the presidential nominee. The two people that have chemistry, and so maybe that'll be the case with Harris. I mean, it does seem as if he's on a longer list of folks being vetted, and it would certainly be exciting for us here. But I think at this point, despite all his attributes, he's probably second tier.
Yeah, at least from what I've seen on many of these lists that speculate potential VP nominees. Yeah, he's usually not at the top, but he is on the list at least somewhere. So maybe he'll be a dark horse, but yeah, to me it looks like there are probably a few more people that would be ahead of him on that list. We're speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com. I want to move on and talk about a column you wrote this week titled, "What Will Happen to Emmer's Beloved Constitution When They Carry Out Mass Deportations?" Because you talk about a podcast that I heard back in 2015 myself. That was This American Life, where Tom Emmer made an appearance on the show back in 2015. And it was talking about what was happening in St. Cloud and the turn against many Somali immigrants in that area. And basically what happened was that there was a public meeting that Emmer attended where many white people in the audience were calling for a moratorium on new Somali residents in St. Cloud. But what's interesting about this back in 2015 is that Emmer largely pushed back against many of these efforts from his constituents, including those that he knew pretty well, against this idea of trying to put a moratorium on Somali immigrants in the St. Cloud area. So can you provide a brief overview of Tom Emmer's at least history and his initial stances on immigration, particularly what we've been seeing in St. Cloud with, again, this interesting appearance he made back in 2015, trying to push back against this idea of putting a moratorium on Somali immigrants. And then now, lo and behold, we see him at the Republican National Convention and embracing this idea of mass deportations. Those will be those signs that we saw all over the RNC. So let's talk about his evolution and his views on immigration over the years.
Yeah, I had this kind of interesting view of Emmer because I arrived in 2014, and so that is, after he had run this pretty brutal race for governor, came pretty close to winning, but didn't. I think he was known as kind of a blustery, bomb-throwing Republican. And then he came back in 2014 to run for the House seat in the 6th District. And when I talked to him, I was covering that race, such as it was, because it's a very solidly Republican district. I did talk to him, and he came across pretty low-key, and he made... at least what he was trying to convey was that he was going to be much more pragmatic, and he was going to mostly look after the interests of the district rather than partisan bomb throwing. And so that was my first impression of him in person when I met with him one-on-one. And then I heard that a couple years later he got elected, and sure enough, he kept his head down, and he seemed to be working on a niche, which was got himself on financial services, an incredibly powerful committee in Washington, largely because of its because you're so close to Wall Street money. And he started working his way up. And then I heard This American Life episode, and it was pretty impressive because politicians, they tend to fall into the trap of telling the audience what they want to hear. And all of these folks in St. Cloud, this is almost a decade ago now, so people may not remember, but there was quite an increase in Somali Americans and Somali refugees living in St. Cloud, and it was pretty quick. And I think it created quite a bit of unease amongst some of the white people in St. Cloud, and there was this actual movement of saying, like, we shouldn't allow any more Somali Americans to live here. And there was Emmer really pushing back and saying, I don't know what you're talking about here. That's not the United States of America. We can't just stop people from moving here. And the United States Constitution allows people to live wherever they want. And clearly it upset some of his constituents, but he held firm. And I was pretty fascinated by it. And then again in 2020, after the election, and there was all this nonsense about it, there being fraud and what we came to call the big lie. And Emmer, unlike so many of his colleagues in the Republican House caucus, he voted to certify the results. And he said the U.S. Constitution does not give me the authority to approve this other slate of electors. The legislatures of these states have sent their electors, and that's what I'm obligated to do by the Constitution. So you hear him talk about the sanctity of the U.S. Constitution, and then there he is at the Republican convention last week. It's hard to believe it was only last week.
Yeah.
But the thing that I found so just astounding and appalling about that convention is just how open they were about this favoring mass deportation, including he had signs made up that said that, and they it was just an absolute monstrosity if you think about what it would mean to try to deport 10 or 15 or 18 million, whatever your estimate of undocumented people here. What that would really entail, and the kind of extra legal and unconstitutional actions it would require, and the sheer depravity and cruelty of it. And so, it's not a perfect parallel because we're talking about undocumented immigrants, whereas in 2015, 2016, he was talking about people who were Somali Americans who were in the country legally. But I still found it to be a rather depressing evolution for him to go from defending the rights of Somali Americans to live in a place like St. Cloud, because that's what the Constitution allows, and also that's just America. I mean, come on. to go all the way from there to 10 years later, got a speaking slot. He's majority whip, and he's standing there. And while they're talking about mass deports, we're talking about the movement of millions of people and everything that would require. So to me, it's a sad story, frankly.
I would agree. I mean, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to go on the stage and try to push back against what he was seeing at the RNC, similar to what he did at that town hall meeting back in 2015 in St. Cloud. But I think it's just more proof that, well, to use the words of Donald Trump, he is going to bend the knee when he has to, whether it is his stance on immigration or, as you were talking about, when he was certifying the 2020 election. It seems like he's someone that is largely willing to do just about anything to make sure he keeps his political power within the Republican Party. And at least in a very craven sense, you can't really blame him, since anyone who tries to challenge the current Republican Party that is a Republican, well, largely gets excommunicated from the party. So I think he's kind of seeing the writing on the wall and seeing what he has to do, which, as we were saying, is a very depressing thought with where the Republican Party is right now.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back 6 months ago or 9 months ago when the House Republicans created all that chaos when they deposed the Speaker of the House, and there was for a minute there when Tom Emmer, the Majority Whip, had made a run for House Speaker, and Trump and his folks, because he had voted for certifying the election results, they called him a globalist rhino, and they whipped votes against him. And clearly, the whole thing was never going to happen, and it was a short-lived attempt to become Speaker. And then Trump did that thing they all have to do, and it was as Trump himself is allegedly said, according to unnamed source in the New York Times, they all bend the knee. And it's a shocking thing to have happened in the Republican Party. I think if there's one clear contrast with the Democrats, when Joe Biden had a bad debate performance, and it was really unclear that he was going to be able to have the energy to run an effective presidential campaign, a lot of Democrats started saying he needs to step aside. And were they thrown out of the party? Were they forced to bend the knee? Absolutely not. They were not. And in fact, they wound up prevailing. I think that's what we expect in American politics, but that is just not the case in the Republican Party.
You can read more about Patrick's column titled, "What Will Happen to Emmer's Beloved Constitution When They Carry Out Their Mass Deportation?" Again, over at MinnesotaReformer.com. I know we're running a little long, so I want to briefly touch on one more story that you guys are working on, and this is something Michelle Griffith wrote about, titled, "Republican Minnesota House Candidate Has a History of Tax Delinquency and Filed for Bankruptcy." And who we're talking about is Isanti Mayor Jimmy Gordon, who is running in a GOP primary against a six-term incumbent, that's Representative Brian Johnson, who is from the Cambridge area. But Gordon, interestingly, has had some tax troubles over the years, including a nearly $39,000 federal tax lien. So what I find interesting about this is that whenever we see this from Republicans, they typically are running to have lower taxes, which obviously seems a little convenient. But tell us a little bit about some of the tax issues he's been running into, and a little bit more about this race for this GOP primary, because as I understand it, Jimmy Gordon is part of this Action for Liberty group, which is a very far-right group that has been gaining prominence within the Minnesota Republican movement.
Right. It's pretty wild here that Brian Johnson is, I think, in his sixth term. He's chaired a committee when the Republicans were in the majority. He's now facing this challenger, I guess because he's not far right enough. And so this local, the mayor of Isanti is challenging him. He actually won the Republican endorsement. Johnson's is going to the primary, so they'll have a primary in August. But certainly the endorsement on the Republican side still means a lot. So the Isanti mayor probably has a good shot at this. He's got a long history of pretty serious financial problems. There's a bankruptcy, and then he had more recently in 2019, he had a $38,000 tax lien on his house by the IRS. That lien has not been released according to the county records. We went up to the reporter went up to the county offices up there to check. He says he's paid that bill that when he sold his last house. More recently, he sold it. He paid off the IRS, and he showed us a picture of a computer screen showing zero balance with the IRS. In any case, in addition to that one, he had a local tax, a state tax issue. He had a couple state tax issues over in South Dakota. I kind of feel like if you have this kind of history, I think the voters ought to know about it, and that's why we went ahead with the story. Interestingly, it's the second bankruptcy we've reported on in House races. So I'm glad that we are around to do some of this vetting, because there's some basics that I think we can expect out of people who are in the legislature, and being up to date on your taxes seems like one of them.
Yeah, and as we said, this isn't the first time he's run into tax trouble, so I'm glad you guys are covering that and bringing, some of these to light to make sure that we have the full picture of who some of these candidates are that are running for a state legislature. And you can read more about Michelle's reporting about this guy, Jimmy Gordon, who is running in a GOP primary against current Representative Brian Johnson. Find that over at MinnesotaReformer.com. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Again, one more time, make sure you go to Minnesota Reformer for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Patrick, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Well, normally when I wrap up my interviews with Patrick, I turn things back over to Matt McNeil, but today, of course, I'm filling in for Matt, so on the other side of the break, you'll get more of me coming up next here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson filling in for Matt McNeil here on this Tuesday afternoon. Well, today, Aaron Brown of Minnesota Brown is going to share a story that sheds light on the realities of healthcare disparities in rural Minnesota and even largely to rural America. Because back in November of 2022, Aaron's mother suffered a life-threatening stroke. She faced numerous challenges due to delayed diagnosis and inadequate facilities in their rural Hibbing hospital, and her story really underscores the urgent need for changes in rural health care. Because while Minnesota does have world-class health care, it can sometimes be a different story if you live outside the metro area. Aaron's going to shed light on his mother's journey, the healthcare obstacles they faced, and the need for reforms to ensure that all Minnesotans have access to quality health care regardless of where they live. So, Aaron, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's back up and talk about what happened in November of 2022. Tell us how this all started with your mom back then and some of the challenges she's faced.
Sure. Well, it was a Friday night, and we went out to a pizza dinner with my wife and some of my sons, and I and my grandmother and my mother went out for a pizza dinner, and it was lovely. And my mother is a child care provider. She worked that day, and went to bed that night after we had all been together, and she woke up very early in the morning. I found this out later, with these flashing bright kind of starburst with huge headaches, and thought that she had maybe just gotten sick because she got sick, and I thought maybe she had caught a bug or something. Well, she woke up like some 8 hours later and couldn't talk or move very well, and so she was able to get to a phone and call my house, and fortunately my son answered, and we happened to be in town, so I was able to run over to, she lives in Hibbing, and we got her into the ER and went through the process. Now, as I explained in the piece, one of the challenges here in rural Minnesota is really it's fundamentally a staffing issue. The people you need aren't just guaranteed to be there. Now, that's partly always true in a rural place, but Hibbing's kind of a rural center. It's not just it's not like a little clinic out in the middle of nowhere. They've got a hospital there, and what happened is they did a brain scan, but they only scanned the front of her head because that was the protocol, and she had what they call a basilar stroke, which is more in the back of the head, and it relates more to physical functions like breathing and swallowing and muscle movements. It's less of had less of an effect on intellection, and so she couldn't swallow and was having difficulty breathing. So she was diagnosed initially with pneumonia. Now she had all the stroke signs that you see on the little posters they put up about stroke, and so we were concerned, but they had run a brain scan and it kind of missed it because of this little technicality of where they scanned. They kind of missed it, and I want to be clear that I'm not, the people, everyone was doing their best, under the circumstances, but it was not getting better, and by the later in the day, another doctor came in and shared our concerns and the concerns of a lot of the nurses, and did a full scan and found the stroke. At that point, there's really no more you can do. The stroke had passed, so whatever damage she had encountered was already incurred. And so, but they did fly her to the cities. It was particularly with her breathing and swallowing. It was kind of dicey. And what that began a 4-month hospital process of getting her out of a medical coma, getting her early kinds of treatments to start working on rebuilding her ability to speak, to swallow, to walk, to grasp, to do all the things that you or I take for granted in walking around and doing things. And, of course, anyone who's been through stroke care or had a family member knows this routine. Basically, though, we were told by many down in the cities that, she's lucky to be alive. Most people who have this kind of stroke under these circumstances don't survive. And so it was life-changing. She was 62 at the time, working person, not really thinking about retirement, not really worried about her health, and all of a sudden her health and well-being is now her central struggle. And so it's been life-changing, and we've been kind of going through trying, one of the other challenges that we encountered was trying to find her rehabilitation. That was another challenge of living in a rural place. Of course, she was down in the cities at the hospital, and she had to kind of step down to rehabilitative care centers. And one of the challenges that you hear about that's true is there's no beds. We've had a rash of nursing home closures over the past 10 to 15 years in Minnesota, most of those closures occurring in rural areas. There's a variety of reasons for the closures, and I'll get to some of that when we talk about solutions. But basically, it's just really hard to find a place near home. And the reason that's important is if your whole family lives, for instance, in the Hibbing-Duluth area, in our case, you want to be close by so you can visit. And it's important to my mom, important to the family. And, she spent about the first 4 months down in the cities, which, you have to drive, you have to find somewhere to stay, you have to feed yourself, feed your kids, get yourself off of work, and different things you have to do to visit. And so, getting her to a place where she could be cared for and to actually get the occupational therapy and physical therapy and speech therapy that she needed was really difficult. It wasn't until really last June she was able to move, so just over a year ago, she was able to move into a senior housing apartment after a great amount of rehabilitation. And she's regained, I'm happy to report, she's regained a lot of her independence in terms of getting around an apartment, cooking, doing all the different things you do to take care of yourself, but has lost, she lost a certain amount of physical ability and speech ability, and in her case, it's affected her, processing time so she can't drive right now, and so it's just it's a life-changing thing, and we have the United States has the best healthcare system in the world, and the worst healthcare system in the world. The best part is that we have the technologies and we have the trainings and people who can do these great, amazing therapies. The worst part about it is it's really difficult to get that healthcare distributed to the people who need it, particularly across a broad area, and especially when you get into rural areas. And that kind of segues into maybe some of what we need to do.
Absolutely. We are speaking with Aaron Brown of Minnesota Brown, talking about a column he recently wrote in the Minnesota Reformer titled Healthcare Implosions Threatens Greater Minnesota. And as you mentioned, your mom is doing better today. And I think a big reason is that she was able to persevere is that, well, she had good determination and also a good support system, including yourself. But I guess where I want to go with this is that no one plans on having a stroke or having a family member with a stroke. Mm-hmm. But if you happen to live, like, let's say, in a metropolitan area, usually it's not terribly difficult to find the facilities you need to get the rehabilitation you need. That might not be the best way to put it. Easy, but it's easier. Yeah, it's easier than if you live in a rural area. And I think there's a challenge that it's easy to forget about if you don't have access to those types of facilities where all of a sudden you're thinking, well, that's about a 3 or 4 hour drive to get to those facilities that we need to get to. And yeah, that provides a lot of challenge if you have someone that suffers a major health emergency in a rural area and your facilities just don't have the staffing or the technology to do that. Because as you mentioned, the folks at the Hibbing Hospital did the best they could. It was just really a staffing issue and the lack of resources that they needed to be able to get your mom the care that she needed.
Right, and just for an example, when my mother did come back north, her most urgent need, and of course you have 1 year after a stroke, the earlier you intervene, the better it is for recovery. And so the first 3 months is really important, and after that, every month is still important. But the earlier, the better. And frankly, early is probably when she had the least intervention, just because of the dicey situation she was in. And so when she was in the mid-level care after 2 or 3 months at the university hospital, she was in this mid-level care where we were trying to find her a bed close to where she could get therapies. Well, we couldn't find that bed, and then when we did, we took a while to get the therapies going, to the point that when she did come back to Hibbing, there was a clinic literally across the street. There is one right across the street from her apartment, but they didn't have a speech therapist, and it was difficult to get an occupational therapist at first, and that's just a staffing issue. They literally had vacancies. And that maybe highlights one of the big problems, particularly as you talk about this issue in Minnesota. You'll hear broad agreement across the partisan spectrum, across the healthcare industry itself, that one of the biggest challenges we have is getting people to work in rural places in healthcare. There's not enough people going into it, period, for the whole market. And then incentivizing people to move out to maybe a very rural place where there aren't as many amenities, particularly if the people aren't from there. It's a challenge to get people to move out to rural Minnesota and work in these jobs for money that is, maybe not as great. And so staffing is one of those key issues, and it's both on the supply side, getting enough people to do it, but then also on the demand side, getting the pay and the benefits that would attract more people into nursing, therapist jobs, physical therapy. Some of these jobs require a lot of school. Physical therapists, I think, take 5 years, which is, more than a bachelor's degree, not as much as being a doctor or a nurse practitioner, but up there in terms of schooling. Well, school is expensive, and this is one of the broader issues we've got. And so, getting people into the right places was a challenge, getting my mom to a local place where she wouldn't have to spend as much time waiting for rides, getting rides. And I also would highlight, we live in a for-profit system, and so if you're in a for-profit system, you have to be thinking about cost, right? That's how businesses work. And one of the challenges is people like my mom are deeply unprofitable. Like she's $1 million woman, and not just figuratively, as I would normally describe her, but literally in the sense of her health care probably cost $1 million by the end of it, and so that's not profitable. There's no profitable reason to do that, and particularly in rural Minnesota, where putting people on staff at hospitals and clinics costs money, and if you're not getting the patient load, because maybe only 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 or 14 people need this service at this time, well, they've made the financial conclusion that it's better not to have a full person there. Go ahead and make the people go farther. Some of that is okay. Some of that is just the way it is when you live in rural Minnesota. That's actually one of the arguments you hear. Why do you live there? And to that, I would just point out, my mother was a child care provider, making, low 20,000s a year, because she loved providing care to children, and because in the broader sense, every family that brought their kid to that child care center needed my mom and her coworkers to do that job so they could do theirs. And that includes the doctors at the hospital, includes lawyers and miners and police officers and firefighters and all these other people that communities need. to do business. And so, this is the thing: is if you want to have a society, you have to kind of care for it at every level. And of course, certain things I would always expect to have to take my mom to Duluth for specialist type stuff. But physical therapy, speech therapy, these are high demand services that are really difficult to provide in rural Minnesota right now because of the systemic problems, not because of the people, but because of the systemic problems.
Well, let's tackle some of the issues on how we can possibly improve healthcare in rural Minnesota. And let's start off with the first and I think most obvious one is how do we get more people to work in rural hospitals? Because it's tough to get people to move there sometimes, whether it's the pay or if they grew up in an area that wasn't around, it can be tough to get them to stick around. So what are your thoughts on what we can do to get people to work in these areas?
Yeah, well, I say there's local, state, and federal solutions. And what you're talking about is actually one that's really important, I think, for both the local and state levels. Locally, I think a lot of small towns. I'm from a rural area, and I'm from the range, lifelong ranger. One of the challenges we've got is we have a culture of kind of, we want it to be like we remember it, and like we want it, we love where we live, and we don't want it to change too much. And one of the challenges is welcoming new people, especially people with skills that you need, means bringing in people who are different, for very different kinds of different. Could be how they look. It could be how they, where they're from. It could be what they like to do for fun and for a living, and all of these things together. And you have to figure out a way for local towns, small towns, rural places, have to find a way for their own sake to get people to welcome people in. And it's a hard thing to do, and change is difficult. But this is a classic example of where sometimes rural places can be their own worst enemy by saying, "Oh, we want only local people in these jobs." There's not enough local people anymore. There's not enough kids coming up the system through the schools, through the local community and technical colleges. I work at a community and technical college, and that's the problem. The schools don't produce enough graduates, and we don't have enough students going into the careers. And so you've got to encourage not just people to stay and to get trained in these professions. That's one part of it, but also to welcome new people, new professionals into your community. It's good for everybody. And so that's a local thing, though, and it's almost as much cultural as it is political. On the state side, I think you can do a lot more to incentivize people. There's a lot of this with loan forgiveness programs for doctors. What if you did the same for nurses? What if you did the same for therapists? Do more to encourage people to spend longer periods of time working in underserved area hospitals and clinics. There's some of that going on, but I think you could do a lot more of it to help. And then, beyond that, you're talking about some of the bigger systemic issues like Medicare reimbursements and Minnesota Care reimbursements, and making sure that the cost of care is covered so that local hospitals and clinics can actually afford to provide that care. And that's one of the disconnects, the lag between the care being provided and then the people who provide the care getting paid for that care. You can look at broadly systemic change, single-payer systems like other countries have, and you can see maybe more efficiencies in how some of that is done. And of course, politically, I'd be very interested in that. But in the status quo and the climate we're in, you do have to think about practically. We might be a few years from that ever happening. We have to figure out how to make the system work better for the people in it now, which is all of us, really. I mean, any one of us could think everything is going fine, but I'll tell you right now, if you have a stroke tonight, any one of us, all your planning and preparations that you might have made will be tested. And, just because you saved some money and you got good insurance doesn't necessarily mean this will be easy. It will be hard and financially devastating, probably regardless. And so what are we doing to help our brothers and sisters and neighbors who go through this? It is literally something that could happen to anyone. And that's the scary part, but also the part that should unite us in doing something about it.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head, too, that we have to do something about the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates, especially with rural hospitals, to make sure that they can get the care that they need to their patients. Well, Aaron, we are just about out of time, but I really do appreciate you coming on the show again. Make sure you check out his column in the Minnesota Reformer. It is from a few weeks ago, but you can find it if you just search Aaron Brown and Minnesota Reformer. Title of the column is Healthcare Implosion Threatens Greater Minnesota. Again, find that at minnesotareformer.com. And also find more about what Aaron Brown writes over at Minnesota Brown. That website is minnesotabrown.com. Definitely glad to hear that your mom is doing better since, strokes can be rough. But, she definitely had a good support system to help her get through everything. But, Aaron, thanks so much for coming on the show and having this great conversation with us.
Thank you, Brett. Thanks for having me, and good luck to everybody out there going through this.
All right, we'll take a break and then wrap up the show coming up next here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota.
When you gonna stop playing?
AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Last segment before we turn things over to Native Roots Radio, who's coming your way, coming up at 5 o'clock. As I talked about at the top of this hour, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are set to be coming to St. Cloud, Minnesota, coming up this Saturday. And Patrick and I were chatting about what are some of the things Trump and Vance might highlight. And one of those things you brought up, Patrick, was the fact that they're probably going to bring up that at one point during the legislative session, the DFL made a push for Minnesota being a sanctuary state, and that very much could leave an opening for Trump and Vance to try to attack Democrats here in the state.
I think they'll absolutely go for that because it was highlighted on their campaign announcement. And you and I were saying, and we want to be careful because we're not commenting on an opinion about what we think about the idea, but it was kind of an unforced error by the DFL to come with that because it wasn't going to pass, and it gave the Republicans in Minnesota, who had really been struggling to find much of anything to work with, it was a free life raft on one of the hottest button topics. I think it was an unforced error.
I kind of agree with you, too, and they're probably going to talk about that a lot on Saturday. Well, that's all the time I have for today. Filling in for Matt McNeil. Stay tuned. We got Native Roots Radio coming up next.